The United Nations building in New York was buzzing with activity that morning. Delegations from across the globe had gathered for a high-level summit on global leadership and stability. Inside one of the marble-lined conference rooms, the air was crisp, the lighting cold, and the mood tense. Karoline Leavitt, the young and outspoken political figure from the United States, stood confidently at the head of the table. She wore a sharp navy suit, her arms crossed as her eyes scanned the room. Across from her sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, his uniform neatly pressed, his demeanor calm but watchful. The two had never met in person before, but both knew the other's reputation. "Ibrahim Traoré," Karoline began, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Your speeches have been making waves. Talking about sovereignty, about rejecting foreign influence." She smirked slightly. "We decide who leads in the world. And we've decided you should take a back seat." A few advisors in the room shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't the kind of language expected in a diplomatic setting. But Traoré didn't flinch. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the polished table. "You decide who leads?" His tone was calm, almost conversational. "The people already have." Karoline's smirk didn't fade, but her eyes narrowed. "Your people may have chosen you," she said, "but global leadership is about more than a local vote. It's about alignment, cooperation, playing by the rules, our rules." Traoré's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I wasn't elected to play by your rules, Ms. Leavitt. I was elected to defend my people from those who think they own the game." The tension in the room thickened. The American delegation whispered among themselves, the African representatives sat silently, watching with quiet approval. Karoline tapped her fingers on the table, as if deciding whether to push harder or back down. She chose the first. "You think your words will shield you," she said. "But influence isn't about speeches, it's about power. And we have more of it than you could ever imagine." Traoré straightened in his chair, his gaze locking with hers. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "you've never imagined the power of a people who refuse to be ruled by fear." The silence that followed was electric. Somewhere in the corner, a journalist adjusted his camera, sensing the story of the day was unfolding right in front of him. The moderator tried to smooth the edges with a soft question about shared frameworks, but the words slid off the table untouched. Karoline leaned in, elbows on the lacquered wood, voice low enough to sound confidential but sharp enough to carry. "Let's be honest, Captain. Leadership isn't a feeling. It's consensus. It's networks. It's access. We built the rooms where decisions are made." Traoré didn't blink. "And we built the houses those rooms sit in. The people outside your doors are still people. They chose me." Karoline lifted a brow. "Chose you, or cheered you? There's a difference. Real leadership is when other nations point to you and say, 'We trust that one.'" He let the sentence breathe, then answered, steady as granite. "Real leadership is when your own people point to the mirror and say, 'We recognize ourselves in that one.'" A ripple moved through the delegations, some smirks, some stilled pens. The moderator glanced at the clock, sensing control slipping like sand. Karoline pushed forward. "You talk about sovereignty as if it's a shield against reality. Supply chains, security, capital, those are realities. You can't opt out." "Opting out is not the point," Traoré replied. "Owning in is. We'll trade, we'll partner, but not as tenants in houses we don't own." Her smile thinned. "Tenants? We invited you in. And sent us the bill," he said. "With interest." The line drew a few hushed laughs from the African bloc, from the American side, tightened jaws and scribbled notes. Karoline folded her arms. "If you refuse the framework, you'll learn what isolation feels like." "Isolation," he said, "is eating from a table where the host demands you forget who brought the harvest." Silence. Cameras leaned in, the way predators lean toward sound. Karoline tapped the table once, a metronome for impatience. You play a romantic story well. But when pressure comes, markets move, borders strain, you will need the rooms we built. Then we will build ours, Traoré said. And fill them with those you left waiting in the hall. For a moment, the whole room seemed to tilt. The moderator cleared his throat, suggested a break. No one moved. What began as posture was becoming principle, and principle was louder than microphones. Karoline's eyes held his. We decide who leads, she repeated, slower now, as if carving the words into marble. The people already have, he answered, not louder, but closer. And the echo reached further than either of them. The break was supposed to last 10 minutes. Instead, it turned into a quiet war of footsteps and glances in the marble corridors of the summit hall. Karoline stepped away from the main chamber, her aides forming a loose wall around her, whispering strategies like chess players mapping the next 10 moves. Traoré, meanwhile, walked alone at first, hands clasped behind his back, until a young delegate from Namibia fell into step beside him. You're rattling them, the delegate said under his breath. Careful, they'll try to box you in with procedures. Traoré smiled faintly. Procedures are just walls with doors they keep locked. We'll find another way in, or build around them. At the far end of the hall, a U.S. trade advisor intercepted Karoline, sliding a tablet in front of her. We can push for a rule change on the voting structure, he whispered. Make his bloc need a 2/3 majority to pass resolutions. That'll freeze him. Karoline's eyes flicked toward the other end of the corridor, where Traoré now stood speaking with a cluster of West African ministers. Do it quietly, she said. If he thinks we're playing hardball, he'll turn it into a story about colonial tactics. We keep this technical. Back in the main chamber, the moderator announced an unscheduled agenda item, resource cooperation frameworks. It was a surgical move, the kind of topic where control over definitions could tilt the entire summit's outcome. Karoline returned to her seat with the faintest curl of a smile. But Traoré had anticipated it. As soon as the floor opened for comments, he stood. Before we discuss resources, he said, we must decide who defines cooperation. Too often, the word means one side extracts while the other side applauds. That is not cooperation. That is choreography. A murmur swept the room. Karoline leaned into her mic, and yet without choreography, Captain, everyone dances into each other. You need a conductor. He met her gaze. The people are the music. We conduct ourselves. For a heartbeat, it was just the two of them in a room full of nations, each aware that this was more than a policy dispute. It was a public test of who would set the tempo for the future. The moderator's gavel struck, calling for order, but the rhythm was already set, and it wasn't written in Washington's score. The moderator tried to smooth the tension with diplomatic filler, but the air was already charged. Cameras panned from one face to another, knowing the headlines were writing themselves in real time. Karoline leaned forward, her voice steady but sharpened like a needle. Captain Traoré, idealism is charming, but history is filled with leaders who claim to conduct themselves, and left their nations in chaos. Without structured oversight, power turns to dust. Some delegates nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. The remark had landed like a veiled insult, painting Traoré as an unpredictable amateur in front of the global stage. Traoré didn't blink. History is also filled with outsiders who claimed to bring order, and left countries in ruins. The difference, Ms. Leavitt, is that when our people make mistakes, we bear the cost ourselves. When your system makes mistakes, the bill comes to us too. It was a counterpunch dressed in calm, but it stung. A ripple of applause rose from the African and South American blocs. Karoline's jaw tightened for just a second before her media-trained smile returned. She switched tactics. Then let's speak plainly, she said. You want to change the voting system here, consolidate a block of influence, and reshape trade deals. That's power politics, not independence. Traoré leaned into the microphone. Independence is power politics, when the power belongs to the people who live with its consequences. The moderator sensed control slipping again and tried to redirect the discussion, but neither leader was interested in detours. Karoline raised an eyebrow, letting her words drip with mock concern. Just remember, Captain, every leader who thought they didn't need allies eventually found themselves surrounded. Traoré met her stare without hesitation. And every empire that thought it could choose our leaders eventually found itself outside our borders. The silence that followed was heavy. Even the translators paused before speaking, as if they wanted the words to sink in unbroken. For the first time, Karoline realized this wasn't just a summit debate, it was the shaping of a narrative that millions would remember. And Traoré had just stolen the momentum. By the time the session broke for a short recess, the confrontation between Karoline and Traoré had already escaped the conference hall. Clips of their exchange were racing across social media, translated into multiple languages within minutes. On Twitter, hashtags like #Traoré vs Karoline and #Who Chooses Leaders trended worldwide. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in front of outdoor screens, replaying the moment Traoré said, "The people already have." In Washington, pundits dissected Karoline's smirk frame by frame, debating whether it was confidence or condescension. Inside the delegate lounge, Karoline's aides were huddled, speaking in urgent whispers. "She has to reframe this," one strategist said. "If we let his line go viral without countering, he owns the narrative." Another replied, "The problem is, his answer felt authentic. That's harder to fight than policy points." Meanwhile, Traoré sat calmly with two of his advisors, sipping mint tea. One leaned in and said quietly, "Captain, you understand you've just lit a fire. Western media will spin this as reckless." Traoré nodded. "Let them. Our people know the difference between reckless and fearless." In the hallway, a group of journalists from Africa, Asia, and Latin America approached him. "Captain Traoré," one asked, "do you think this confrontation will harm your chances of securing trade agreements?" Traoré smiled faintly. "If a trade agreement depends on silence, it's not trade, it's tribute. And Burkina Faso does not pay tribute." Karoline, across the room, caught that quote being scribbled into a reporter's notepad. She clenched her jaw. Her next move would have to be surgical, calculated to make him stumble without appearing openly hostile. But what neither of them realized was that back in their respective capitals, political forces were already calculating how to weaponize this clash. In some places, it would be used to rally support. In others, to justify pressure. The summit had several days left. And after this first skirmish, everyone knew, this was no longer about policy papers. It was a test of willpower, and neither side intended to blink first. When the summit reconvened, the air in the room was noticeably sharper. Delegates shuffled in with an energy that felt less like diplomacy and more like the lead-up to a prize fight. Karoline entered first, her expression carefully composed, every step deliberate. She had spent the break recalibrating her approach. This time, she wouldn't give Traoré the luxury of the last word. As the moderator welcomed everyone back, Karoline raised her hand before the agenda could resume. "Before we proceed," she began, her voice clear and slightly edged, "I'd like to address a statement made earlier." All eyes turned toward her, then to Traoré. She looked directly at him. "Leadership, Captain, is more than a popular vote. It's about stability, alliances, and the responsibility to act in the global interest. The people may choose, but it's the international community that decides whether a leader is ready to stand among equals." A few delegates shifted uncomfortably at her choice of words, especially the international community decides. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré's face, waiting for his reaction. He leaned back in his chair, silent for a moment. Then, with a calmness that almost seemed rehearsed, he replied, "Madam, if equality requires permission from those who already hold power, then it is not equality, it's a gated club. And Burkina Faso doesn't need a membership card to exist. The words landed like a gavel strike. A ripple went through the audience, some whispered approval, others frowned. Karoline, refusing to be rattled, smiled tightly. "Captain, you talk about independence as if the rest of the world is an enemy. But history shows that isolation breeds weakness. Without partners, no nation thrives." Traoré's eyes sharpened. "Partnerships built on respect thrive. Partnerships built on obedience rot from the inside. We've learned to tell the difference." The moderator hurried to move the discussion forward, but the duel had already left its mark. Both had scored points with their respective supporters. Yet beneath the polished exchanges, each understood that these were not just rhetorical jabs, they were positioning themselves for a much larger geopolitical battle. The next panel on the agenda? Resource sovereignty. And both knew that was where the real fight would erupt. The session shifted to resource sovereignty, and the atmosphere in the hall thickened. This was no longer polite debate, it was the raw core of why Karoline and Traoré had clashed in the first place. The moderator introduced the topic: global stability depends on the responsible management of resources, energy, minerals, and agricultural land. We invite both sides to present their positions. Karoline spoke first. "Let's be honest," she began, projecting her voice so the translators didn't miss a syllable. "Resources are global commodities. They must be integrated into the world market to benefit everyone. Hoarding them for domestic use may seem patriotic, but it destabilizes economies and isolates nations from the very trade that sustains them." It was a measured argument, dressed in the language of economic rationality. Several Western delegates nodded. But Traoré's expression didn't shift, he looked as if he'd been waiting for this exact speech. When it was his turn, he rose from his seat, resting his hands on the table. "Madam, what you call hoarding, we call ownership. Our gold, our uranium, our cotton, these are not global property by default. They belong first to the people who live on the land where they are found." He stepped closer to the center, voice gaining weight. "For decades, Africa's resources flowed outward, profiting companies and governments far from our shores, leaving our people in poverty. You call that integration. We call it extraction." Karoline smirked, though there was a flicker of irritation behind her eyes. "And without foreign investment, how will you develop the infrastructure to even reach those resources?" Traoré's answer came like a blade. "By building it ourselves. By partnering with those who come with fair terms, not chains hidden in contracts. And if that means slower growth, so be it. At least it will be our growth." The room was quiet for a beat, delegates exchanging glances, some scribbling notes. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore, it was a statement many resource-rich but exploited nations understood all too well. The moderator announced a short recess, but as attendees rose, it was clear the real discussions would happen in the corridors, alliances being tested, deals whispered, and strategies redrawn. The moment the recess was called, Karoline slipped away from the main hall, heels clicking against the polished marble of the summit corridors. She wasn't heading for coffee, she had a meeting scheduled, one she hadn't told the press about. In a small side room, two men in tailored suits waited. One bore the insignia of a multinational mining corporation, the other, a discreet lapel pin from a Western intelligence service. Karoline closed the door behind her. "He's gaining sympathy," she said without preamble. "The narrative is shifting in his favor. If this keeps up, we lose leverage not just over him, but over half the African bloc." The intelligence officer leaned forward. "We can plant doubts. There are channels, social media accounts, economic reports, that can suggest mismanagement, corruption, maybe even instability back home." The corporate man nodded. "If we shake investor confidence, his reforms will stall. That's when we can offer help, on our terms." Karoline didn't smile this time. Do it quietly. No fingerprints. I want him defending himself instead of attacking us in the next session. Meanwhile, in another corner of the summit venue, Traoré was approached by a delegation from Southeast Asia. They spoke in low tones, offering something Karoline hadn't anticipated. Alternative trade routes, resource exchange agreements, and mutual defense cooperation. You stand against the pressure, said the leader of the delegation. We've done the same. We can help each other. Traoré listened carefully, his expression unreadable. He knew the value of allies who understood what it meant to resist global giants. Every offer came with risks, but unity among the independent was a counterweight to any empire's reach. As the recess ended and both leaders returned to the chamber, the air between them was charged. Karoline believed she had just set a trap. Traoré knew a storm was coming. The question was, who would weather it better? Within hours, Karoline's machine went to work. Anonymous accounts flooded the digital space with allegations, claims of diverted funds, whispers of unrest in Ouagadougou, leaked memos suggesting key ministers were plotting against Traoré. Even some Western news outlets picked up the chatter, citing unnamed sources. At first glance, it looked effective. Reporters at the summit began asking pointed questions, subtly framing Traoré as a leader under siege at home. Cameras followed him with a little more suspicion, waiting for a misstep. But Traoré didn't flinch. He had expected something like this. A week before the summit, he had quietly authorized Burkina Faso's cyber defense unit to monitor foreign disinformation campaigns. Every post, every bot, every fabricated source was being traced. By mid-morning, his team had mapped a clear path back to Western PR firms and think tanks linked to Karoline's allies. The moment came during a panel on global trust and transparency. Karoline spoke first, delivering a speech about the need for accountability in leadership. It was sharp, elegant, and clearly aimed at him. When it was Traoré's turn, he walked to the podium without notes. Some speak of accountability, he began, while their operatives flood the world with lies in the shadows. He paused, letting the room settle. We traced those lies. And I invite the press to see the evidence, today, in this building. Gasps rippled through the audience. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she forced a polite smile. She hadn't expected him to move this fast, or to bring the fight into the open in front of cameras. This is not just about me, Traoré continued. It's about the principle that the will of a people cannot be bought, rewritten, or manipulated by those who think leadership is theirs to grant. The applause started small, then grew. For the first time, Karoline felt the weight of momentum shifting back to him. Her trap was still in motion, but somehow, he had turned the spotlight into his weapon. The press room was electric. Dozens of journalists, cameras, and live feeds poured into the side hall where Traoré's team had set up large monitors. On the screens, digital maps pulsed with lines of code, IP addresses, and screenshots linking the smear campaign to a network of contractors in Washington and London, firms with deep ties to Karoline's backers. Some reporters gasped audibly. Others began frantically texting their editors. The story had shifted in real time, the target of the attack had become the one exposing it. Karoline entered the room flanked by aides, her polished expression hiding the crack of unease beneath. This is political theater, she said loudly, addressing the cameras. It's designed to distract from his own failings. Traoré didn't raise his voice. Theater? Perhaps. But these are your actors, your script, your stage. I'm simply turning on the lights. He stepped closer, looking directly into one of the live broadcast cameras. To the people of Burkina Faso, and to every nation that has fought for its own dignity, remember this moment. The world has just seen that those who claim to decide who leads will not hesitate to undermine your choice. We will not be silent. We will not be owned. The room erupted, not with shouts, but with a rumbling wave of applause and camera shutters. Even journalists who had been skeptical leaned forward, sensing the historical weight of the moment. Karoline stood frozen, her smile now tight, her eyes calculating. She knew the damage was done. Traoré had not just defended himself, he had redefined the battlefield. As the session ended, Traoré walked out through a corridor lined with reporters, their microphones reaching for him. He offered only one final sentence before stepping into the light of the summit courtyard. Leadership belongs to the people, always. And with that, he left her standing in the shadow of her own failed challenge. Today was never about me. It was about the principle that no leader, no matter how powerful, has the right to dictate the will of the people. We are not pawns on a global chessboard. We are nations with our own history, our own voice, and our own future. To those who think they can decide who leads us, look around. The people have already decided. And their decision will stand, with or without your approval. We do not fear your influence, because true power does not come from titles, money, or threats. True power comes from the people, and that is something you will never own.